He's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 28 years of experience.
And he's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief, and most recently, a wonderful memoir. Together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing discussion about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. Well, Howard, we're back with another episode, and today thought we'd do something different. We started out this podcast, and I work as an agency, as everybody knows who listens or watches this podcast, and you do workshops. And for me, I like doing this podcast because you're a friend and I like talking about advertising. I like talking about creative briefs. But one of the things early on that I said is, don't be shy about promoting your workshops, because this is a great vehicle for that. And I am gainfully employed with a steady salary, and you teach workshops, which means you're kind of a freelancer. You're out there and you do the work when you get it, right? And so I think the promotion of your workshops is something we've been negligent in, and I wanted to talk to you and ask you a few questions about your creative brief workshops. But before that, I wanted to ask you, you've told the story many times how you got into asking questions about the creative brief. You became very curious about it, and you wrote your first book, How to Write an Inspired Creative Brief. How did that turn into doing workshops? Like, when did that happen, and how did that happen?
Well, I appreciate the question, Henry, and the opportunity to kind of blow my own trumpet here. I'm not always the best at doing that. I had a gig in Minneapolis at an agency where I was the creative director for the 4 loyalty programs of British Airways North America. In fact, you'd say that British Airways North America is their biggest chunk of business on the planet. A lot of travelers going from major hub cities in the US back to London and back and forth. I wasn't on the job for more than a month when I kind of discovered that one of the folks in the New York office, we had an office in Minneapolis, we had an office in New York, so I got to travel to New York regularly. But we got a brief from one of the account folks in New York, and I don't know if she realized that I also got a copy of we called it the Marcom brief from the client. So I had the Marcom brief, which was about 20 pages. That's no surprise. We've heard that story many, many times. And our 2 or 3 page creative brief, which was supposed to have been culled down from the Marcom brief. And I discovered very quickly that this particular account person cut and pasted from the Marcom brief.
Exercise those cut and paste fingers.
Exactly.
Apple X, Apple V.
And I think the account person was not aware that I had both the Marcom brief and her brief, and thought, I'll just get away with this. And who knows how long she'd been doing this before I started the job. I put a stop to this, and it gave me the opportunity to go to my bosses. And I had a creative director I worked for, and she had the executive creative director that she reported to. I went into her office one day, and they were both sitting there together. And I like to tell this story in my workshops because I started to ask the question. I explained what happened. I said, would you mind if I were to take my staff through a training on how to write a brief? I didn't get the sentence out of my mouth before they stopped and said, please, we know that this is a problem. No one has volunteered to step up and do this. I had no idea what I was going to do, but I did create, it was a 6 or 7 page document. It was a 2-hour training, but that was the impetus. From there, my gig lasted about 3 years. I've never worked any place longer than 3 years. And that gig ended when the folks at the British Airways realized that I had more chutzpah than they had asked for. And I used my time, as a freelancer after I left that Minneapolis agency, and I produced the workbook and the creative training that became the workshop that I do now. And I also started a blog. So within about a year, I took the best parts of the workbook for my workshop and my best posts on the blog, wrote a couple of of connecting chapters, and voila, I had my book.
So you were actually doing workshops before the book.
Yes, not many, but I would do one or two a year,
But
while
the
I was
book
working.
came out of the workshops and your blog posts. Wow, that's
Yes.
interesting.
So workshop first, blog second, book third.
So then the book comes out, and that's how I found the book, and that's how we met. Um, I asked you to come teach a workshop at Alma, which is the agency that I was at the time, and you did. My boss was very receptive to your book, and we all got a lot out of the workshop. Um, but so at that time, you were basically out on your own freelancing doing these workshops. Like it was just catch can. Like they would come in because of the book, or how did that work?
I was doing a bit of freelancing as a working creative still at that time.
Okay.
I was probably, I think I didn't go full time into teaching the workshops until 2017. So I was freelancing in Minneapolis, and that was the bulk of my work. And I would occasionally get workshops. Most of the time at that stage, it was for the marketing departments of major clients. I didn't do many workshops for ad agencies like I did for you.
I got you. I thought you had stopped freelancing a lot earlier. I didn't realize you
No.
were through 2017. You were still working as a freelancer,
Yep.
writing copy. Okay, because I know you I believe teach literature or English or
Well, yeah, it's at about to the point of 2012, 2013. I would still take on a project every now and then, but most of my time was spent teaching college. So I was doing
okay.
three things. I was teaching almost full time, doing the occasional freelance gig, and when the projects materialized, I would do these trainings. And in those days, it was none of it was virtual. It was all get on a plane and go
Oh
somewhere.
yeah, absolutely. And so, how did you get hooked up with the ANA? When and how did that come about?
I had one of those moments where I said, I don't like teaching college and being paid like well, it was described as the new working poor. If you're an adjunct in college, you're making almost no money and you're jumping from one school to the next. Now, I love teaching and it is a calling, and I love working with young people. But I started asking around. I did what everybody advises that you do when you want to try something new. You tap into your network. And I started reaching out to people in my network and I said, you know about my book. You know that I love to teach. I want something better. What do you advise? And I had a conversation with the president, the CEO of an ad agency in Hollywood, Daly and Associates. He's long since retired. And he was the one who said, you need to connect with the ANA. And he gave me a name. And that's how I met someone. I happened to have a workshop assignment in San Francisco. The ANA representative in the West Coast was in San Francisco. And she came and watched me do this workshop and said, Howard knows what he's doing, reported back to her boss in New York. And in January of 2017, I made the decision that at the end of that spring semester, my teaching career at community college came to an end, and I went full time working for the ANA.
Excellent, excellent. So when you start a workshop, you get a group of marketers in the room, and they're there because they want to learn how to write a brief. What is that you promise them? Like, what is it they're going to get out of a workshop with you? And is it a 1 day workshop? How are the workshops work?
They unfold in two different ways. They can be half-day workshops, basically 4 hours, or they can be a full-day workshop. Those are rarer. Most of what I do is a half-day, 4-hour training, and I have 5 topics. But my bread and butter is a workshop called What an Inspired Creative Brief Looks Like. So my promise is there. Actually, it's art. I have two promises. One is a creative brief is hard. And you and I have talked about this many times. It's hard to write a creative brief. If it were easy, everybody'd be doing it and I wouldn't have anything to do. I can't make the process easy, but I can make it easier if you follow these principles that I've acquired by either my research, my own experience of teaching, and in the years that you and I have been, doing work, the podcast now, my conversations with you, I can show you shortcuts to make the process easier. The second promise is it's often received with skepticism, that I can turn the process of writing a brief into something that's actually fun. Because the philosophy I take is this is not something you do by yourself. And you, Henry, would be surprised how many marketers take this thing on as a siloed exercise. They do it by themselves with no input. And even you who are territorial about your briefs, justifiably so, do a fair amount of collaboration yourself when you take a draft of your brief to your creative director. You never spring a brief onto the creatives for the first time at a kickoff. But it's surprising how many marketers do the same thing. And when they realize that collaboration with fellow marketers or other creatives takes a lot of burden off their shoulders, all of a sudden it becomes a little more fun.
Well, I'm gonna correct one thing you said. You said that it's not easy to write a brief. I think it's really easy to write a shitty brief. And
Okay,
as your uh, account service colleague who cut and paste will attest, it's easy to do that. I think the people stress about writing a good brief, like the ones that are conscientious, right?
right.
Stress about writing a good brief. And that is, as we've said, is not easy. And it requires being conscientious. It requires some heavy lifting in terms of thinking. Um, uh, I think one of the scariest things about a brief, and it's in your book and in your workshops, is being choiceful. When you choose, that means you're excluding certain things. And that can be scary because the client's natural philosophy or tendency is to throw everything into a brief because they don't want to miss anything.
Right.
And really, it's not about capturing everything. It's about capturing the most important thing. And so that's a challenge. Um, so what's your philosophy of the brief, or is that what you were basically saying? The
It comes down to collaboration. I mean, Bill Bernbach taught creatives a valuable lesson, provided the industry with its golden era by doing something that we look back on today and say, well, duh, why did it take so long to figure that? He took an art director and a copywriter and put them together and formed the creative team. So no one works as a silo. We do the same thing now with briefs. It can be, and I say you should have a writing buddy. Or as, for example, when we talked to our friend Matt Ryan at the Universal Resorts in Orlando, they workshop a creative brief. Now, this is a highly trained strategist who understands the intricacies of a brief writing the way you do as a strategist, and yet he understands the value of collaboration. So that's what I introduced to the marketing teams that I work with. Don't do this by yourself. So many times I ask the question, so how many of you collaborate? Everybody raises their hand and I say, well, explain your collaboration. Oh, I write a draft of the brief and then I send it out for comments. I said, that's not collaboration. That's an exercise in masochism, because then you have to figure out whose comments carry the most weight. And the answer is always the same. The
yeah,
boss's comments carry the most weight.
yeah.
And all of a sudden, you're not talking to the creative department anymore. You're talking to your boss.
I just want to close out the episode by encouraging those of you within the sound of our voice. If you're struggling with writing briefs, if your organization struggles with writing briefs, call Howard Eibach. The website is creativebriefworkshops.com, and reach out to Howard. Sure that a deal can be arranged. And I would say it's a bargain at twice the price.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, I do virtual and in person, so we can make something work one-on-one as well as groups,
Got you.
whatever
And
you
I would
want.
encourage people, and I know the virtual is a cost saver. I would encourage people to do to do in person, just because there's something that gets lost still today in this virtual thing. Like, people aren't necessarily paying attention. There's other things going on. When you're in person, you're there, you're concentrating on that one task. I would encourage that. But creativebriefworkshops.com. Good stuff, Howard.
Good stuff, Henry.
He's Howard Eibach.
And he's Henry Gomez, and together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time. Bye-bye.